Okay.
So
Are we away? Okay.
Perfect.
So again, thank you very much for having me. And from the outset, I'd also like to acknowledge the leaders of the CALF project in Evan, of course, Rod, Seth and Tanya for this great initiative. Calf strain injuries are prevalent in terrestrial sports, with peak prevalence as high as 23.2% reached in marathon runners. Although if we examine a timeline of injury occurrence, at the time of injury onset, little is known about the characteristics of the injured players and the injury circumstances, as well as the risk factors present predisposing to the injury event. Post-injury, we're aware that recovery periods can be very variable, ranging from 0 to more than 120 days in the literature. And there is this ever-present risk of recurrence, either during the rehabilitation period or shortly after return to play. And we know from John Orchard's recent paper published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine that this level of risk may not return to baseline for the calf until up to 4 months post-index injury, which is significantly longer compared to other common lower limb muscle strain injuries. So shortcomings of the available evidence extend to the epidemiology and risk factors specifically related to recurrences. And overarching this injury situation is the manner in which we best assess and manage calf strain injuries, which includes effective injury prevention strategies and optimising the rehabilitation period to achieve a successful return to play. So clearly there's a dearth of information available relative to the problem calf strains represent, which is really the reason we're here and that the CALF project has been developed. So we began by investigating risk factors into future calf strain injuries and published our systematic review in the British Journal of Sports Medicine in 2017, where we aimed to evaluate and synthesise current evidence to establish risk factors, but also we wanted to direct our future research into the epidemiology, risk factors, prevention, assessment and management of injury. Our key findings were that there's strong evidence for older age and having a previous history of a calf strain as intrinsic risk factors for future calf strain injury, while there's also limited evidence that athletes with a previous history of lower limb soft tissue injuries and a previous knee joint injury are susceptible to a subsequent calf strain injury as well. We found that there's evidence for no greater or lower risk, essentially no association for intrinsic factors of greater weight, side dominance, height and gender. And we found that being in the pre-season period was an extrinsic risk factor for a future calf strain, which could be associated with running workload and high volumes typical of this stage of the competition season, where again there were a number of other extrinsic factors found to lack an association with future calf strain event. So really, in summary, our key findings were that there's strong evidence for the non-modifiable intrinsic risk factors of older age and a previous history of calf strain. And we also perhaps need to be mindful of the impact of having a history of other previous lower limb injuries on our risk profile for calf strain events. There are shortcomings of the available evidence, particularly related to modifiable intrinsic risk factors, and whether these are standalone risk factors or whether they moderate the impact of non-modifiable intrinsic risk factors such as age and injury history, as we've seen for other lower limb soft tissue injuries such as hamstring strain injuries. The injury type, such as whether it's an index or a recurrent injury, as well as the muscle injured, such as whether it's a soleus or gastrocnemius injury, is also often overlooked or not included in the study design and injury definitions today, which led to our second study investigating the epidemiology of calf strains in elite Australian footballers, where clearly the injury circumstances, the characteristics of the injured players and the muscle involved could have an impact on injury occurrence and prognosis. So in this study, we aim to describe the epidemiological features cohort of elite athletes and to identify whether there are potential differences in functional progression and return to play for index versus recurrent injuries, injuries involving soleus versus gastrocnemius, as well as the mechanism of injury. 184 calf strains reported to the soft tissue injury registry over 4 consecutive seasons were analysed, and the data included player demographic information, information about the training and match history at the time of the injury, MRI, and the number of days to reach 4 functional progression milestones, namely time taken to pain-free walking, running at faster than 90% of maximum speed, return to full training and culminating in return to play. In overview, there were 41 to 51 calf strains per season, 81% of which were index injuries and 19% were recurrence events. Soleus injuries were far and away the most prevalent, representing 85% of cases, which is contrary to previous evidence prior to the routine use of MRI, as well as other epidemiological data from sports such as American football, which suggests that gastrocnemius injuries are perhaps more prevalent in those sports, which leads to a question or a consideration around the mechanism or how these injuries are occurring. And we can see that almost 45% of index events occurred without a known or specific inciting event, contrary to what we see clinically for other common muscle strain injuries. In contrast, 60% of recurrences occurred during running-related activities, and this susceptibility to recurrence during running-related activities could be related to the high relative loads and large loading rates the calf encounters during running activities, and might have implications for how we manage calf strains to avert the risk of a recurrence, which I think was a concept that Seth captured very well in the first presentation in this series. Do the differences in mechanism extend to the muscle involved? We found a considerable proportion of soleus injuries occurred without a specific inciting event, and if they occurred during running, they were commonly occurring while running at a steady state speed. In contrast, gastrocnemius injuries were common during high intensity running and acceleration activities, and were less common during steady state running, where clearly from an injury prevention and a management perspective, these differences in mechanism of injury could influence what we do. And this concept of mechanism could impact how we consider prognosis, where just pooling the running-related activities, injuries occurring during running-related activities versus non-running related activities, we found a significant difference in the time taken to return to play for injuries that occurred during running-related mechanisms, taking on average an additional 11.9 days to return to play. But we know that all calf strains are not equal when it comes to return to play prognosis. And we observed that recurrent injuries took significantly longer time to run at faster than 90% of maximum speed, return to full training and return to play. And with reference to the muscle involved, while soleus injuries took on average 3.6 days longer to run at faster than 90% of maximum speed, 6 days to return to full training and 6.3 days to return to play, these differences were not found to be significant. Prognosis can also be evaluated with reference to whether or not a recurrence occurred, quantified as the cumulative incidence as shown in this figure, where we found that just over half of recurrences occurred early, that is within 2 months of the date of the index strain, 20% occurred prior to the median time to return to play, and the occurrences near exclusively involved the soleus muscle. Athletes sustaining recurrences were also on average older and more experienced, or had a greater playing age than those that did not. So the key findings from this study were that soleus injuries seem to be the most prevalent in elite Australian football players. Evidence of differences in the mechanisms of index versus recurrent injuries and soleus versus gastrocnemius injuries could provide insight into specific prevention and management strategies for these injury types, for these muscles involved. Prognosis seems to be impacted by factors other than just the muscle injured, including clinical and MRI data not evaluated in this study, and the contributions from Carlos Pedret and colleagues in this space should be acknowledged as well. Factors that could predispose to recurrent injuries warrant further investigation, including the factors identified to potentially have an association from this study, such as primary involvement of soleus, older age, and greater playing age. Which leads to the third study we're going to mention today, where clearly more injury associated with the pathology that it observed on MRI, as well as clinical data, could have impact on what we're seeing for prognosis post-injury. We published our investigation into these outcomes in the American Journal of Sports Medicine, where we aim to describe the characteristics of index versus recurrent injuries observed on MRI and functional progression post-injury according to the anatomical location of injury. We also aim to explore the potential associations of clinical and MRI data on both return to play and recurrence. The MRI positive calf strains recorded in the soft tissue injury registry of the Australian Football League over 4 consecutive seasons underwent independent classification by blinded radiologists, which included the muscle injured, such as whether it was a soleus or a gastrocnemius injury, the strain position, such as the medial lateral superior inferior position, as well as the depth of the injury, the primary anatomical location of injury, such as whether it was located at the central intramuscular aponeurosis of soleus, i.e. the central tendon, the medial and lateral intramuscular aponeuroses of soleus, the posterior intermuscular aponeurosis of soleus, and the anterior intermuscular aponeuroses of the medial head and the lateral head of gastrocnemius. The presence of aponeurotic disruption at the primary anatomical location of injury, ranging 0 to 100% of the structural cross-sectional area, the presence of waviness, the edema length, and the presence of scar tissue previous calf strain injury. Regarding our first study aimed to evaluate whether the anatomical location of injury alone is associated with return to play prognosis, we observed considerable variation in return to play prognosis across the most common anatomical locations of soleus and gastrocnemius injuries. Subsequently, we do not find a significant association between anatomical location of injury and time to return to play, which progresses our understanding since hallmark data showing central intramuscular aponeurosis injuries have a significantly worse return to play prognosis than other anatomical locations. Although if we examine the trajectory of recovery post-injury according to whether there's evidence of aponeurotic disruption at the anatomical location shown in red versus injuries with no aponeurotic disruption shown in blue, we can see commonalities, and that soleus intramuscular aponeurosis injuries took significantly longer to reach some functional progression milestones and return to play post-injury. Pooling these data, regardless of the muscle or the anatomical location, injuries with aponeurotic disruption took significantly longer to return to play. Similarly, grading these injuries further, injuries with severe aponeurotic disruption took a significantly longer time to return to play than injuries with none, suggesting this may be an important MRI characteristic to evaluate with more robust statistical approaches. Which is what we did, where we evaluated the time taken to return to play following injury and examined the impact of clinical and MRI data on this outcome. We can see potential univariate associations for a running-related mechanism of injury, the primary involvement of soleus, as well as both the presence and greater severity of aponeurotic disruption on a greater time taken to return to play. Although upon multivariable regression, a greater time to return to play was only associated with the running-related mechanism of injury across all injuries. Examining the subset of soleus injuries only, soleus injuries showing aponeurotic disruption and soleus injuries that occurred from a running-related mechanism of injury were associated with a greater time to return to play as well. We next examined the characteristics of recurrence events relative to the index injury, where here we're examining whether or not the recurrence involved precisely the same spot as closely as we can observe on MRI, i.e. the same muscle, precise anatomical location and position. Over the 2-season surveillance period, recurrence events indeed most commonly involved precisely the same muscle, anatomical location and position, followed by the same muscle, a different location and a different position. Examining the subset of our early recurrence events, we were interested in whether the clinical hypothesis of early recurrences are even more commonly occurring at the same spot as closely as we can observe on MRI. And our data would support this, with almost 2/3 of early recurrences occurring at the same muscle, anatomical location and position, which could have implications for how we approach our rehabilitation during our return to play period. does aponeurotic disruption at baseline predispose to recurrence? Simply observing the raw recurrence rate, you see that injuries with aponeurotic disruption at baseline had a high incidence of subsequent recurrence, suggesting this may be an important injury characteristic to evaluate further with more robust statistical methods. And clinically hypothesised, is the severity of recurrence events greater? Does the pathology extend on MRI when we observe it? We found that the recurrence events over the 2-season surveillance period were most commonly of the same severity in terms of the MRI finding of aponeurotic disruption. We next evaluated the risk of recurrence, those that occurred early within 2 months of the date of the index strain. And we're specifically interested in the impact of both clinical and MRI data on early recurrence. And we can see univariate associations for older athletes, a history of previous calf strain and a history of ankle injury predisposing to an early recurrence. Upon multivariable regression, a greater risk of early recurrence was seen for older athletes and athletes with a history of an ankle injury, and specifically for early soleus recurrence, older athletes were at a greater risk as well. We next explored the overall risk, that is recurrence at any point within a 2-season surveillance period. And we can see univariate associations for older athletes, athletes with a history of a previous calf strain, running-related mechanism of injury, as well as the presence of aponeurotic disruption observed on MRI. Although again, upon multivariable regression, clinical and not MRI factors were associated with a greater risk of recurrence, with older athletes and athletes with a history of a previous calf strain at the time of the index injury having a greater risk of recurrence within 2 seasons. Again, examining the subset that was soleus recurrences, there was a greater risk for those athletes with a history of previous calf strain at the time of the index injury as well. Another important finding was that the time taken to return to play had no impact on the risk of recurrence observed during either period, early or overall, which is a concept in a current study, but beyond the realms of the current presentation. And again, it could have implications for how we view management post-injury to avert the risk of recurrence. So the key findings from this study were that, taken alone, the anatomical location of injury is unrelated to the time taken to return to play. We should perhaps be considering the impact of clinical factors such as the mechanism of injury and MRI findings such as the presence of aponeurotic disruption, and whether these together inform an increased time to return to play. Clinical factors such as older age, previous ankle injury and a previous calf strain injury are associated with an increased risk of recurrence, not baseline MRI findings, which is consistent from a study, a recent systematic review for recurrent hamstring muscle strain injuries. And that concludes this presentation. Thank you for having me, and I'd like to acknowledge everybody on this slide.
Wow, brilliant, Brady. Thank you so much for your presentation and sharing us with a wealth of knowledge on calf muscle strain injuries in AFL athletes. We'll open it to everyone now who may have a question regarding your work. And if not, I'll shoot a few at you.
Thank you.
Anyone want to? Any comments, questions, you can type in the chat box as well. To get things going, I thought I'd ask, why do you think calf muscle strain injuries are synonymous with older athletes? You've shown in your data that there seems to be a trend of older athletes sustaining these injuries. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, really good question. Thank you, Evan. And there's perhaps 2 primary ways of looking at this. It could be associated with age-related changes, and those age-related changes can be split into neurological and also architectural or related to the structure of the muscle tendon unit, where we know that as we increase age, we get associated changes in both of these areas that might impact function negatively or reduce load tolerance, and that could predispose to recurrence in older athletes. The other way of looking at it is that we know that older athletes have been more exposed, and there's also a greater likelihood or a greater risk that they've accumulated injury history to this point over that exposure. So not only are they more likely to encounter injury mechanisms, but they're more likely to have predisposing intrinsic non-modifiable risk factors for future injury. So they're perhaps two ways that we could consider the age conundrum. Does that answer your question, Evan?
Yeah, and Rod's following it up. How would you objectively assess age-related contributors that you've mentioned? It's getting tricky.
Yeah, getting tricky. Well, how would we measure this?
So the guts of the question is, you know, age is a risk factor, but it's not like everyone ticks over to 30 and suddenly gets a calf injury. So of those features you were talking about, you know, whether they're neurological or their tissue quality or whatever else, if we actually wanted to drill down and say, listen, mate, you're 30 and this other thing has happened because you're 30, which makes us get worried about you getting a calf injury, how are we going to actually drill into that part of things, which then obviously leads to, right, is there any sort of preventive intervention we can do for these guys? That's the guts of it.
Yeah, really good question. And the thing that I sort of think about straight away in that space, working with athletes over the course of a competitive season and how we can get meaningful information, is that perhaps if we were able to agree upon, you know, a few key monitoring tests that could be tracked, and fluctuations in the performance of those tests could be tracked over the course of the season, in conjunction with data related to their match exposure and their training exposure, I'd have more optimism that we could get information from that approach compared to, you know, the sort of more traditional baseline screening approach where we might look to get a measure of muscle tendon unit stiffness, or we might look to get a measure of early rate of force development day one of the pre-season, and use that to predictively evaluate associations with future calf strain. And I guess it's sort of leaning a bit on the concepts related to Martin Wallen's PhD and that injury prevention model, which I think is a useful way of thinking about the problem there.
Perfect. Thanks, Brady. Seth, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Go ahead. Thanks very much, Brady, for your talk. Great stuff. So the question really is regarding the group that had the gradual insidious onset the next day sort of set of symptoms, and whether you think that that group actually potentially injured during activity, but the inflammatory markers reach enough of a level to stimulate pain via the next day. Because we all know in sort of sports like AFL and rugby and football that actually the adrenaline's pumping, and it's sometimes afterwards when we've had a shower or get up the next morning that you're like, oh yeah, that's sore. So that's my curiosity, I guess.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and that's a clinical challenge where you can do your post-match screening and speak to everybody and nobody has any issues, and then within 24 or 48 hours, for whatever reason, you have somebody with a calf muscle strain injury, often involving soleus. And one way of looking at this is we know that the innervation to the deep calf is not typical of what we see in other commonly injured lower limb muscles. It can be compartmentalized and follow the compartmentalization of the architecture in the deep calf. So it might be that, you know, we're not even perceiving symptoms at the time, where clearly we're not if they're not reporting anything. And the other way of looking at this is the high proportion of type 1 fibres, type 1 skeletal muscle fibres that are slow twitch in nature, which, you know, there is some argument, some preliminary evidence that these could be prone to cumulative failure over time. And it mightn't be that they've specifically strained at a location within their soleus during the match only, but they've had this progressive development of pathology that's occurred, you know, over the week and is associated with what they've been up to in their training activities and their matches previously. But those are speculations, and speculations at this point.
Perfect, Seth. Happy with that. We've got Mr. Power. He's saying that an age-related loss of lumbar disc height seen in a number of his older athletes with recurrent posterior soft tissue injuries. As a comment, do you have anything to touch on that?
Yeah, from a clinical perspective, I would, yeah, that observation does seem to hold true to some extent. And is that associated with denervation of motor units that occurs distally more quickly and proximally later? That could be a possibility. And then age-related changes in the lumbar spine, they could be associated with different exposure to training activities and conditioning activities off the field, where they might have a reduced exposure with their running and their training, or they might have a reduced exposure to particular gym-related activities to manage lumbar pathology, which then predisposes them to a lower limb soft tissue strain injury.
Yeah, so changes in load exposure. Russell is just wanting you to clarify the anatomical location of injury not correlating to return to play. However, then you've got the central aponeurotic tendon with a prolonged prognosis, correlated with prolonged return to play. So he just wanted you to clarify that one.
Yeah, really good question. So if we just examine the data and call where the injury is located alone, so is the pathology observed at the central intramuscular aponeurosis, i.e. the central tendon, is it located at the medial aponeurosis or the lateral aponeurosis? Just calling that primary anatomical location of injury was not associated with return to play timeframes. But then when we pull the data and we start to explore the presence of aponeurotic disruption versus not, there was a significant association for soleus injuries and greater time to return to play, which is across anatomical locations. So it's the central, medial, lateral, and also the posterior intermuscular aponeurosis. So I hope that clears that finding up for you.
Russell, happy. I've got one last question, I think, unless anyone else wants to say anything. It's a great little chat. So do we delay running? I think we do, but for soleus injuries, we know that the mechanism of running is associated with a longer return to play now. How do you delay running? Do we delay running? I think that's a return to running seems to be a tricky one.
Yeah, and this is something that we've evaluated in a study that's close to submission, where we conducted semi-structured interviews with 20 experts from around the world and asked them what they do in terms of injury assessment and management. And we wanted to know about this as well. When are we running calves? How are we determining when to do it? Because even in this study, an early return to run for soleus injuries was cited as one of the most common causes of recurrence. And where we got to from that study was that ultimately two things need to be displayed. Load tolerance, which is usually in the form of a strength marker, and that strength marker might be slightly different depending on the sport, but there needs to be a capacity to tolerate load prior to running. And then the other facet of it is stretch shortening cycle capacity or proficiency. So they need, the underpinnings to be able to go through a stretch shortening cycle, which is usually tested just with a simple submaximal vertical hopping test, either for repetitions, 10 to 20 repetitions, or for a time, so 30 seconds or 45 seconds, where if they're not able to do that simple clinical test, they don't have the underpinning qualities to then go out and do a first run post-injury. So a few concepts in there, Evan, but I think we got there in the end and answered what you were after.
Yeah, and something to look forward to with the papers that you've submitted. Should be coming out soon, I guess. Henry Park has got a question for you. What objective measures do you tend to use during pre-season screenings? for calf strength and endurance?
Yeah, so the primary question is, according to a needs analysis of the sport, what is the end goal and what do we need and what are those properties? So we identified in the qualitative study that there is diversity in the calf demands across sports. In sports such as ballet, strength endurance with a single leg calf raise capacity over time, a number of repetitions just with body weight, with a metronome 1 second to 1 second, was seen as useful information. Whereas in other sports, such as the rugby codes, it was more valuable to know about the relative strength and capturing whether quite high relative strength was present in their athletes if they expected that strength to be protective in any way of a future calf strain injury. So I think that sort of answers the question there, in that it begins with a needs analysis of the eventual demands, and then within those strength markers, which capacity is most important? Is it brute maximum strength? Is it loaded strength endurance, like we often see in the sport that I work clinically, Australian rules football? Or is it more just a sheer strength endurance quality with a simple single leg calf raise? There is some, I guess, finesse to that testing as well that can be done related to specific players or players from particular positions, where some clinicians are more interested in strength during a particular contraction mode, and eccentric impulse and things of that nature in rugby to withstand basically what they do in the scrum. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it does really well. Jared has raised his hand. Do you want to comment, Jared?
Just unmute yourself, Jared, and jump on.
Hang on, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, I've got different headphones on. How was the needs analysis performed with demands of different sports? Because I find that quite interesting, that ballet has a requirement for more strength endurance versus rugby, which is obviously a requirement of higher and greater rates of force development. I must have missed that.
Oh, so in terms of performing a needs analysis, in my experience, that's a conversation among key stakeholders and what your injury prevention priorities are within the high performance team, which includes medical, physiotherapy, of course, strength and conditioning, and sports scientists, and the properties that you think are most important to underpin performance, and then working back from that.
I see. Thanks.
Thank you. Good question.
Perfect. I think that was a pretty heavy discussion. Well done on answering a huge, diverse range of questions. And thank you again for your time this evening. It was a really great presentation, and I think everyone will be able to take something home from that, and it was really good. So thank you. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Just to quickly note, next month we've got Michael from the British Institute of Sport presenting on the specificity of calf injuries in athletics. So look out for that one. We'll share some more information. Thanks, everyone.